Man of Steel is the sixth major motion picture based on Superman. I'm not counting the old serials or the spin-off Supergirl, and it reboots the series after the last five were sort of mixed in quality. The original Superman was a classic. I've already done a review of that, and its sequel, Superman 2, was also good, if not a bit all over the place. But Superman 3 turned it into a dippy comedy, and Superman 4 was low rent and all sorts of bad. Superman Returns tried to return the series to its glory, pretending only the first two films happened, and while it was a fine movie that I did enjoy, it was also a bit too long and concentrated too much on telling a story about the character Superman, rather than a story involving Superman. In other words, they were trying to deconstruct and examine the character, and what was left was a movie that was fascinating in some ways, but not a whole lot of fun. And while Superman Returns got blasted for that, it was, after all, trying to follow in the footsteps of what Richard Donner had done with the first movie and part of the second one. Remember the original Superman movie? There was some action, but it was a whole lot of talking about who Superman is instead of showing you what he does. I mean, there was even that long scene where Lois Lane recites a poem about him. Yeah, it worked in the context of that film, but when you say it out loud like that, it sounds kind of ridiculous. Man of Steel gives us the director of 300 and Watchmen and the producer that had directed the Dark Knight trilogy, so there's a lot of comic adaptation pedigree here, and it really does show. In Man of Steel, Superman isn't a perfect godlike paragon of awesomeness as he was played by Christopher Reeve, nor is he a flawed messiah trying to come to grips with his impact on the world as he was played by Brandon Routh. But rather, Superman here is a man who very much wants to just help people and use his powers for the betterment of mankind, but he knows that someone with his level of power will instantly be mistrusted and feared, so he does his thing secretly, living as a drifter who goes from place to place until he's forced to use his powers to save someone, then he vanishes and goes elsewhere. He's off the grid, but he doesn't do a spectacular job of covering up his tracks. When dicking around with an old spaceship that he finds in the Arctic, reporter Lois Lane is also up there looking for an interesting story, and after she gets attacked by one of the robots in the ship, he has to save her, and then of course she becomes obsessed with finding out who he is. Kal-El is pretty easy to track down as urban legends follow him wherever he goes, and tracking him back to an event in his childhood turns up the name Kent pretty quickly. While Lois is Superman chasing, the rest of the planet is dealing with an arrival of a UFO, which is helmed by Zod, who has been looking for Kal for quite a long time. Kal's father Jor-El stopped Zod from taking a codex of all planned Kryptonian births, which could be used to jumpstart their culture even though Krypton is gone. Zod wants to revive Krypton and use Earth as the base of this, and when Kal messed around with the spaceship, which was an ancient Kryptonian scouting vessel, he got Zod's attention. Zod tries to bring Superman to his side of things as he feels guilty about having killed his father, but Superman realizes that Zod means to terraform Earth, and that means that the human population won't survive the process, so he fights against Zod. The movie is deliberately paced and very character-driven, and heavily laden with flashbacks to Superman's childhood, usually involving his adoptive father Jonathan, played by Kevin Costner, who manages to steal every scene, including the ones he's not in. Jonathan allowed himself to die in a tornado instead of having Clark save him because he knew the world was not ready for a Superman. But with Zod holding the Earth ransom, Superman has no choice but to fight for his adoptive home. Zod isn't alone either. He has a gaggle of Kryptonian soldiers with him, who are mostly faceless villains, though his right-hand woman, Faora, is highly memorable and almost a greater villain than Zod himself. The movie starts slow and builds slowly to a crescendo, with the plot and action building up towards a climax that revels in its own spectacle. Previous Superman movies had been chided for a lack of action, and this is something that no one in their right mind could accuse Man of Steel of. Whether he's saving workers from an exploding oil rig or having a city-destroying one-on-one battle with Zod, the movie is peppered liberally with action scenes, which are fast, frantic, and a treat for the eyes, but there's enough of the human element and character development to stop it from becoming one-dimensional. The performances are great, but the standout is Kevin Costner, as I mentioned, and Lawrence Fishburne does a great job. I found Russell Crowe to be rather subdued as Jor-El, and Mike Shannon as Zod comes out as smarmy and unbalanced, but I think that's what they were going for with those characters. The special effects are really good, and I like the way that the movie was filmed. The primary colors, the ones that make up Superman's suit, pop out, but all the other colors are muted. Man of Steel isn't perfect. I think the constant flashbacks could have been ordered a bit better. I would have preferred to see some of Superman's childhood at the beginning rather than skipping to him as an adult and then flashing back many times, but maybe that's just me. I also think that the ending is going to be controversial to a lot of Superman fans. I had no particular issue with it, though. You have to go into it knowing that this version of Superman isn't a perfect person. He's just a very powerful guy with a strong moral center who wants to help as much as he can. One last thing to note, I saw the film in 3D, and I have to say in this case, it wasn't worth it. If you want to see a movie in 3D, go see Star Trek Into Darkness. That one looked great, but in this case the 3D was extremely subtle and barely noticeable in most scenes. You might as well just not even bother and save a few bucks. Man of Steel isn't on the same level as, say, the Dark Knight trilogy, but it's a really good start to a possible new Superman franchise, and it didn't lean on the crutches of either constant action or just its strong performances. Instead, it goes for a balance of both. I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10, and the hope that that means there's room for improvement.